Hello, my name is Lynn Donovan, and I am the theologian in residence at St. Andrews in Picton. Want to share some thoughts with you this morning around an experience that the people of Israel found themselves having to wrestle with, and how I think it very much mirrors some of the experience that we are having to wrestle with. And then I want to share some ideas from a good book. So the Babylonian exile was a period in the life of Israel, 6th century BC. Israel had claimed this land of promise. They had built a capital city called Jerusalem. They had appointed a king and then had built a temple. So everything was in place for this theocracy to proceed. And then suddenly, the empire, which at the time was Babylon's armies came marching through Jerusalem, kind of destroyed most of the temple, and took the brightest and best of the community into exile in Babylon. Just another day in the life of an empire. And the folk who found themselves in Babylon were like, what the? And we'll recall that psalm that reflects the heart of the people of Israel. It is a psalm made famous by Boney M. Remember, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And so those who were gathered in Babylon, who up until then had depended on all of these externals to provide their life with a framework and meaning and understanding of God. So, well, wait a minute, God gave us this promised land. We're not there anymore. What happened? Then God gave us a king and then a temple. And all of those things indicated to us that we were favorable in God's eyes. And now that they're all gone, what does that mean? What does it mean about us? What does it mean for our faith? And so I think we can find ourselves in the same position, and that is many things, many of those externals that were part of our lives, giving framework and meaning to our lives, have now disappeared. Gathering with friends for Sunday dinner, gathering as communities of faith, in some cases gathering at the office, heading out on a holiday together, getting together with another family so that our kids could play, gone. And so I'm going to introduce a word here that is provided by Catherine May, who wrote a book entitled Wintering: The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. This book was born out of her own experience of hitting a wall in regards of her health. And yet she kept going, because we're all taught to push through it, aren't we? Until her doctor looked at her and said, "You're very sick, you need to stop." And she thought about, why is it that I needed a doctor to tell me that I needed to stop? And so she reminds us of this season, both of the planet, that then is reflected in our lives, this season of winter, and has a conversation about what that might mean and what it might serve, because winter is not the end of the life cycle. It is the crucible of the life cycle. It is a time when we stop, we rest, we take stock, we get our house in order. And so we know that to be true as a season, but we also know it to be true as a season of our hearts. And so she shares a couple of stories that I'm going to share with you. She shares the story of her son who wrestled with profound anxiety as an adolescent. Then she and her husband decided to take him out of school. They decided that if they did not take that action, they were sending him a really bad message, and that was that his pain did not matter. And they spent the time teaching him to winter and teaching him that they could trust them with his darkest season. And she talked about building resilience in children. Includes giving them the tools and reminding them that winter is a season in our own lives, and it will come and go regularly. That's life. And then she encourages us to teach one another how to winter. She says unhappiness has a function. It tells us that something is going wrong. And so we need friends who will tolerate our gloom. We need people to acknowledge that we can't always hang on, that sometimes everything breaks. We need friends who will allow us to be weak until we find our feet, because weakness, breaking, loss, grief, endings are simply seasons of life. And she said that in her new normal, now when she finds herself going into those periods of winter in her soul, she treats herself like she would her most beloved child. She looks after herself, she takes herself for walks, she prepares good food for herself. And she allows herself to rest while at the same time asking herself, because it's not the end of the road, what change is coming. And so she concludes by affirming what we know deeply to be true, and that is that life is deeply cyclical. That everything repeats itself and nothing lasts. And if we can grasp and believe how fleeting this life is, how delicate, then we can begin to set our minds to a better way of living it, which is not about grasping onto those things that can't be grasped. And so I suspect we, as both people and communities, very often in this last year have shared those words from those in exile in Babylon. How can we sing? How can we find joy? How can we find meaning in this strange land when we have lost so much that is dear to us? And yet surely we are being invited to recognize the deeper truths of our lives, and that is nothing is forever, and maybe that is not such a bad thing. And so I encourage you, as you continue to mark your days with perhaps rest, with perhaps renewal, or others for whom this season has offered no rest and renewal, those whom we have to hold in our hearts, parents especially who are at home with children who are anything but restful, those who are on our front lines, in the hospital, first responders. Our hearts need to hold them with encouragement and tenderness. And as we continue working our way through our own wintering practices, let me leave you with this question. Based on what we have learned during this pandemic winter, who do we want to be in the spring? Who do we want to be as individuals? And that larger question, what might a new season, a new spring for humanity look like? And let me close with those words that are echoing around the planet these days by someone who certainly understands seasons of winter, Amanda Gorman, poet laureate at the inauguration, who was mute as a child. And yet in her most glorious poem, The Hill We Climb, shared these words with the world last Wednesday. There was always a light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. I wish you good rest. I wish you eyes to see where the light will be revealed. I wish you courage and hope as we continue to make this journey together.